Before New York, before London, before Rome, there was mud. Not metaphorical mud, real river mud. 5,000 years ago, in the land we now call Iraq, two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flooded their banks every year. They left behind thick, dark soil. And in that soil, something unusual happened. People stopped wandering. They stayed. This place was called Mesopotamia. The name literally means land between rivers. And between those rivers, humans did something they had never done before at this scale. They built cities. One of them was called Uruk. Not a village, not a camp, a real city. Streets, temples, thousands of people living in one place. For the first time in history, strangers lived side by side. But living together creates problems. Who owns what? Who pays whom? Who decides what's fair? So they invented something else. Writing. Not poetry, not novels, records. They pressed symbols into wet clay tablets to track grain, animals, and trade. Those marks became the world's first writing system, cuneiform. And once words could be recorded, memory no longer depended on people. It depended on clay. That changed everything. Generations later, a king named Hammurabi ruled in this same region. He did something radical for his time. He wrote the laws down. Not secret rules whispered to elites, public laws carved into stone. If you stole, there was a consequence. If you harmed someone, there was a rule for that. For the first time, justice wasn't just power, it was written. And think about what that really means. Cities, writing, laws. Those aren't small inventions. They're the foundation of everything around you right now. The street outside your house? That's city planning. The school system? That depends on writing. The idea that rules apply to everyone? That traces back to those early laws. If Mesopotamia had remained just another stretch of riverbank, if people had never settled there, we wouldn't just be missing an ancient chapter of history. We might be missing the idea of civilization itself. Because civilization didn't appear fully formed. It started with mud bricks, clay tablets, flooded fields. It started with people trying to solve everyday problems. That's what makes Mesopotamia powerful. Not mystery, not myth. It's powerful because it feels human. Farmers dealing with floods, merchants arguing over payments, leaders trying to control growing populations. Real problems, real solutions. And from those solutions, the modern world slowly emerged. Today, the land still exists, the rivers still flow, the dust still rises in the same heat, but buried beneath that dust are the first attempts at being what we now call civilized. So the real question isn't just where was the first city built? The real question is how many ideas we call modern are actually echoes from that ancient riverbank. The plow breaks ground, not casually, not gently. It carves into earth that has baked under months of brutal sun. The wood scrapes against stone. The farmer leans into it. His hands are calloused. His back aches. Sweat runs down his face and mixes with dust. But he knows something his grandfather didn't. He knows the river will come. Every year, like clockwork, the Tigris and Euphrates swell. They overflow. They flood the flatlands. And when the water recedes, it leaves behind something more valuable than gold. Soil. Dark, thick, fertile soil. But there's a problem. The flood doesn't care about your field. It doesn't stop where you need it to stop. It drowns crops. It washes away seedlings. It comes when it wants. So the people of Mesopotamia did something that sounds simple, but changed the course of human history. They controlled it. They didn't pray to gods and wait. They dug. They carved channels through the earth, long, shallow trenches that bent the river's path, canals that guided water where people wanted it to go, not where nature decided. These weren't small projects. Some canals stretched for miles. They required planning, cooperation, hundreds of people working together, season after season, moving earth with nothing but wooden tools and their own bodies. And once the water could be controlled, everything changed, because now you could grow more than you needed. Surplus. That one word unlocked everything. Before surplus, every person spent most of their time finding food, hunting, gathering, surviving. There was no time for anything else. But when fields produce more grain than your family can eat, someone has to store it, someone has to guard it, someone has to decide who gets what. And suddenly, you don't need everyone to be a farmer. Some people become builders, some become priests, some become soldiers. Specialization begins, and with specialization comes something else: hierarchy, because the person who controls the grain controls everything. In early Mesopotamian villages, it wasn't kings at first, it was priests. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was the bank, the storage facility, the distribution center. Farmers brought their surplus to the temple. Priests recorded it. They redistributed it during lean seasons. They decided who received rations and who didn't. This wasn't charity, this was power. And power, once concentrated, doesn't stay small. The villages grew, the canals expanded, the surplus increased, and then, around 4000 BCE, something unprecedented happened. A city emerged. Not a large village, not a cluster of homes, a city, Uruk. If you stood at its gates around 3200 BCE, you would see something no human generation before you had ever seen. Walls, massive walls stretching into the distance, mud brick stacked on mud brick, thick enough to stop armies, tall enough to cast shadows over entire neighborhoods. Inside those walls, 40,000 people. 40,000! Think about that. Most human beings alive at that time lived in groups of 30, maybe 50, extended families, tribes. But Uruk had 40,000 strangers living side by side. That's not natural. Humans aren't built for that. We're wired for small groups, familiar faces, shared blood. So how do you make 40,000 strangers cooperate? You build systems. Uruk had streets, not paths worn by feet, but planned streets, wide enough for carts, organized into districts, residential areas, merchant quarters, industrial zones where pottery was fired and metal was worked. At the center stood the White Temple, a massive structure raised on a platform, gleaming in the sun. It wasn't just impressive, it was a statement. We are not scattered anymore. We are organized. We are powerful. And around that temple, life hummed. Bakers shaped barley into bread. Brewers fermented beer in large clay jars. Weavers worked looms, transforming wool into cloth. Carpenters cut timber. Metalsmiths hammered copper. None of these people grew their own food. They didn't have to. The surplus supported them. But surplus creates a problem. You need to track it. If a weaver trades cloth for grain, someone needs to remember that. If a merchant delivers oil to the temple, there needs to be proof. Memory isn't enough, not at this scale. So they pressed marks into clay. At first, it was simple: a circle for grain, a symbol for sheep, basic pictures. But pictures have limits. You can draw a sheep, but how do you draw "the shepherd delivered 10 sheep to the temple on the 5th day after the flood"? You need more than images. You need symbols that represent sounds, ideas, grammar. And slowly, over centuries, those pictures evolved. They became cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus. Not art, not decoration, information. Thousands of clay tablets have been found. Most of them are boring: receipts, tax records, inventory lists. But boring is the point, because those boring records mean something profound. They mean society had grown too complex to live inside anyone's head. The baker couldn't remember every transaction. The priest couldn't track every offering. The merchant couldn't recall every trade. So they externalized memory. They made it physical. And once you can write things down, you can do something else. You can teach people who weren't there. You can send messages across distance. You can preserve knowledge after you die. Writing didn't just record civilization, it accelerated it. In Uruk, young boys were sent to the Edubah, the tablet house, the world's first schools. They didn't learn stories first, they learned cuneiform, hours of repetition, copying signs onto clay, memorizing hundreds of symbols, making mistakes, getting corrected. It was hard. Most students were sons of elites. Scribes became a class of their own, educated, respected, essential. Because the scribe held power that couldn't be taken by force. He held knowledge, and knowledge, once written, becomes permanent. Somewhere in that same city, centuries later, someone pressed a different kind of text into clay. Not a receipt, not a contract, a story. The Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the oldest known epic, older than Homer, older than the Bible's written form. It tells the story of a king, Gilgamesh, 2/3 God, 1/3 man, arrogant, powerful, restless. He befriends a wild man named Enkidu. Together they fight monsters, they defy gods, but Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh, for the first time, understands what it means to lose someone. He becomes obsessed with immortality. He journeys to the edge of the world, searching for eternal life. He fails. He learns that immortality isn't for humans, that life is brief, that meaning comes not from living forever, but from living well. It's a story about mortality, about friendship, about the limits of power. And it was written in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago on clay. Why does that matter? Because it means they weren't just surviving, they were asking the big questions. What does it mean to die? What makes life worth living? What happens when strength isn't enough? Civilization isn't just irrigation and walls. It's the moment people start writing down their fears and hopes, when they try to answer the questions that don't have obvious solutions. That's when survival becomes culture. And culture, once it takes root, starts to shape everything, including power. Because as cities grew, so did complexity, and complexity demands order. Uruk had priests, Akkad had kings, and Babylon had both. By 1750 BCE, a king named Hammurabi ruled Babylon. Babylon wasn't the first city, it wasn't the largest, but under Hammurabi, it became something else. It became a state, not just a collection of people, a system, an idea. And Hammurabi did something unusual for a ruler. He didn't just command, he codified. He created a law code, the Code of Hammurabi. 282 laws carved into a massive stone stele, public, permanent, unavoidable. If you hurt someone's eye, you lose your eye. If you knock out someone's tooth, you lose your tooth. If you steal, there's a consequence. If you break a contract, there's a penalty. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We've heard that phrase so many times it sounds ancient and obvious, but it wasn't obvious. It was revolutionary. Because before written law, justice was personal. It was revenge. It was whoever had more power. If someone wronged you, you responded how you wanted. Blood feuds could spiral for generations. But Hammurabi's code said no. There are rules. They apply to everyone. You can't just kill someone because they killed your brother. There's a process. There's proportionality. Was it fair by modern standards? No. The penalties varied by social class. A nobleman's life was worth more than a slave's. Women had fewer rights than men. But here's what mattered. It was written. It was public. It was the same for everyone in the same class. That's the seed of something bigger. The idea that authority isn't just force, it's legitimacy. And legitimacy comes from rules people can see, understand, and reference. You could point to the stone and say, This is what the law says. That changes the psychology of power. Hammurabi wasn't just a king, he was a lawgiver. And lawgivers don't rule by fear alone. They rule by structure. The stele stood in the center of Babylon. Anyone could see it. Merchants, farmers, slaves, priests. And even if most couldn't read, they knew it was there. They knew someone couldn't just take their property without consequence. They knew deaths had terms. They knew punishments weren't random. It wasn't justice as we know it, but it was a version of it. And once people experience even a flawed version of justice, it becomes hard to go back to chaos. Because humans crave predictability. We want to know what happens if we plant a field, sign a contract, build a house. Laws give us that. And Mesopotamia, for all its flaws, understood that before almost anyone else. But laws weren't the only thing they formalized. They formalized time itself. Right now, you're reading this in minutes and seconds, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Why 60? Why not 10? Why not 100? Because of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians used a base 60 counting system, sexagesimal. It sounds complicated, but it's incredibly useful. 60 is divisible by a lot of numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, 60. That makes calculations easier. Fractions become simpler. So they divided the day into 12 double hours, each double hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. And we still use that system every single day, on every clock, in every time zone. They also divided the circle into 360 degrees. Why? Because their year had 360 days, roughly. So they mapped the sky the same way, 1 degree for each day the sun moves through the zodiac. They tracked planets. They named constellations. They knew the difference between stars and wandering lights, planets. They could predict lunar eclipses. They knew Venus disappeared and reappeared in cycles. They weren't guessing. They were recording, calculating, testing. This was early science, not in a lab, not with telescopes, but with patience, observation, pattern recognition, and math. Mesopotamians didn't just count, they calculated. They understood multiplication, division, square roots, and even early algebra. Clay tablets have been found with geometry problems. A student calculates the area of a field. Another works through the volume of a grain silo. These weren't philosophers debating abstract theory. These were practical people solving real problems. But the tools they built to solve those problems became the foundation of mathematics. They mapped the night sky. They mapped their fields. They mapped trade routes. The earliest known map is from Mesopotamia, a clay tablet showing the Euphrates River, mountains, cities, the world as they knew it, pressed into mud. That's another first. Humans had walked the earth for thousands of years, but Mesopotamians were among the first to try to represent it, to turn experience into diagram. That's abstraction. That's symbolic thinking. That's the beginning of how we navigate complexity. And they used that same thinking in medicine. Mesopotamian healers weren't witch doctors. They were diagnosticians. They recorded symptoms. They cataloged diseases. They tried treatments and observed results. Some of it was mixed with religion. Illness was often seen as punishment from gods. Healers were part priest, part physician. But they also used real medicine, herbs, minerals, bandages, salves. A tablet describes how to treat wounds. Another lists plants and their uses: opium for pain, thyme for digestion, myrrh for infections. They performed surgery. Simple procedures, yes, but they opened abscesses, they set bones, they stitched cuts. They didn't have anesthesia, they didn't understand germs, but they tried. And trying matters, because every medical journal today, every prescription, every diagnosis chart descends from that same impulse: observe, record, treat, learn. Mesopotamia wasn't just building cities, it was building systems of thought. And those systems were held together by something older than law and deeper than math: religion. In Mesopotamia, the gods were everywhere. Not distant, not abstract. They lived in the rivers, in the storms, in the harvest, in the silence after a battle. There wasn't one god, there were thousands. Anu, the god of the sky, Enlil, the god of wind and storms, Ea, the god of water and wisdom, Ishtar, goddess of love and war. It begins in chaos, primordial waters, Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, and Apsu, the freshwater abyss. From them the gods are born, but the gods are loud, restless. Apsu wants to destroy them. Ea kills Apsu. Tiamat rages. She creates monsters to avenge him. The younger gods are terrified. None can stand against her, except Marduk. Marduk, the storm god, young, strong, ambitious. He agrees to fight Tiamat, but only if the other gods make him king. They agree. Marduk slays Tiamat, splits her body in two. From one half, he creates the sky. From the other, the earth. From her eyes flow the Tigris and Euphrates. And from the blood of her consort, Marduk creates humans. We are made from the blood of a slain god, created to serve, to work, to worship. That's the Mesopotamian worldview. Humans aren't the center of the universe. We're the labor force. But we're also necessary. The gods need us. Without humans, there are no temples, no sacrifices, no one to maintain the cosmic order. So there's a relationship, unequal, yes, but real. And woven into that mythology is something else, a story that sounds familiar, the flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a man named Utnapishtim. The gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, but Ea warns Utnapishtim in secret. Build a boat, bring your family, bring animals. The flood comes. It lasts 6 days and nights. Everything is destroyed. The boat lands on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven doesn't return. The waters have receded. Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice. The gods smell it and gather like flies. They regret their decision. They grant Utnapishtim immortality. Sound familiar? It should. This story predates the biblical flood by over 1,000 years. It's not about religion. It's about culture, about how stories move, how they evolve, how a flood myth in ancient Sumer becomes part of the foundation of later traditions. Mesopotamia didn't just invent cities and laws. It invented narratives that still echo. Because humans need stories. We need explanations. We need meaning. And Mesopotamia gave us some of the first written attempts to answer the deepest questions. Where do we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? Those aren't small questions, and they didn't have small answers. But while priests told stories and managed temples, another kind of power was rising: military power. Because cities don't just grow, they compete. Uruk wants more land. Wants control of trade routes. Lagash and Umma fight over water rights. At first, conflicts were small, raids, skirmishes. But then, someone did something different. A man named Sargon of Akkad. Around 2300 BCE, Sargon wasn't born into royalty. He was a cupbearer, a servant. But he was ambitious. He overthrew his king, seized the city of Akkad, and then he kept going. He didn't just conquer one city, he conquered them all. Sumer, Akkad, Elam, parts of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. For the first time in history, multiple cities were united under one ruler, not a city-state, an empire. Sargon didn't just raid, he organized. He installed governors. He standardized weights and measures. He built roads. He created a professional army. Soldiers who trained full-time, who fought for pay, not just plunder. That changes warfare. Before, battles were seasonal. Farmers picked up weapons during the dry season and went home for planting. But Sargon's soldiers were always ready, and that made him nearly unstoppable. His empire lasted for over a century. It eventually fractured, as empires do, but it set a precedent. Conquest wasn't just possible, it was profitable, and others followed. The Assyrians took it further. By 900 BCE, Assyria was the most feared military power in the ancient world. They didn't just fight, they terrified. Iron weapons, siege engines, cavalry units, psychological warfare. When Assyria besieged a city, they didn't just attack, they documented it, carved it into stone, showed prisoners being impaled, cities burning, populations enslaved. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was strategy. Surrender now and you live. Resist and this is what happens. Most cities surrendered. Assyria controlled trade routes from Egypt to Persia. They built libraries, roads, aqueducts. They were brutal, but they were organized. And that's the paradox of empires. They bring order, they bring innovation, they spread ideas, but they bring it all at the point of a sword. Mesopotamia understood that because Mesopotamia lived it. For 3,000 years, the land between the rivers was conquered, rebuilt, reconquered. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Each wave brought change, new gods, new languages, new rulers. But underneath, life continued, because empires rise and fall, but people still need to eat. In a small house in Babylon, a woman kneads dough. Her hands work the barley flour, pressing and folding, the same motion her mother taught her and her grandmother before her. Outside, the city hums. She doesn't think about kings. She doesn't think about empires. She thinks about her children, her husband, the leaky roof that needs fixing. She thinks about the price of oil, which went up again, about the neighbor who still owes her family 3 shekels of silver. Daily life in Mesopotamia wasn't grand. It was this: bread, beer, work, family. Most people were farmers. Even in the cities, small plots were tended inside the walls. Barley, wheat, lentils, onions, dates. They ate bread every day, flatbread baked on hot stones, sometimes flavored with sesame or herbs. They drank beer, not as a luxury, as nutrition. Mesopotamian beer was thick, almost like porridge, made from barley, fermented in large jars, drunk through straws to filter out the chunks. Everyone drank it, men, women, children. It was safer than water. It had calories. It made hard labor bearable. Meals were simple: bread and beer, sometimes fish from the river, occasionally mutton or goat if you could afford it, vegetables, lentils, chickpeas, cucumbers, leeks. Fruit came from date palms. Dates were everywhere, eaten fresh, dried, pressed into syrup, fermented into wine. Honey was rare. Sugar didn't exist. Dates were the sweetness of life. Trade brought other things: timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from the eastern mountains. Merchants traveled in caravans, donkeys loaded with goods, weeks on dusty roads, nights under stars, danger from bandits, risk from weather. But the profits were worth it. A merchant could buy cheap in one city and sell high in another. Contracts were signed, witnessed, recorded on clay tablets. If you defaulted on a debt, it followed you. Scribes kept records. Commerce wasn't casual, it was formalized. And women participated. Not equally, not freely, but more than in many later civilizations. Women in Mesopotamia could own property, they could run businesses, they could sign contracts. Some were brewers, some were tavern keepers with significant wealth and influence. Marriage was a contract, negotiated between families. A bride price was paid, dowries were given. Divorce was possible, rare but possible.
If a woman was mistreated, she could appeal to authorities. If a man divorced his wife without cause, he owed compensation. Again, not equality, but structure, rules. Children were raised in extended families. Boys learned their father's trade. Most couldn't read. Only the wealthy sent sons to scribe schools. Girls learned domestic skills, weaving, cooking, managing a household. But childhood was short. By 12 or 13, you were working. By 15, you might be married. Life expectancy was low, 35, 40 if you were lucky. Infant mortality was high. Childbirth was dangerous. People lived with death. It was always close.
When you flood fields year after year, water evaporates. Salt stays behind. It builds up in the soil. Slowly, over centuries, the fields became less productive. Barley, which tolerates salt better than wheat, became the dominant crop. But even barley has limits. Yields dropped. Populations pressured the land. Forests were cut down for timber and fuel. Soil eroded. The rivers shifted course. Canals silted up. Maintaining them required constant labor, and constant labor requires organization, authority, resources. When those systems weakened, the land suffered. Wars didn't help. Constant conflict drained resources. Young men died in battle instead of working fields. Armies trampled crops. Sieges starved cities. Empires expanded beyond their ability to control. Rebellions flared. Governors became warlords. By 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age was collapsing across the entire region. Trade routes failed. Cities were abandoned. Mesopotamia survived, but it changed. Babylon rose again under the Chaldeans. The Hanging Gardens were built, one of the wonders of the ancient world, but the glory was fading. Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. Alexander the Great took it in 331 BCE. The Greeks came, the Parthians, the Romans. Mesopotamia became a province, a memory, a ruin. The rivers still flowed, the land still existed, but the cities crumbled, the canals filled with sand, the tablets were buried. For 2,000 years they lay underground, forgotten, until archaeologists began digging in the 1800s, until they found the walls of Uruk, the libraries of Nineveh, the law code of Hammurabi, and suddenly the modern world remembered. We remembered where we came from, because when you walk through any city today, you're walking through an idea born in Mesopotamia. The grid of streets, the laws on the books, the schools where children learn to read and write. When you check the time, you're using their base 60 system. When you read a contract, you're echoing their clay tablets. When you look up at the stars, you're seeing the same constellations they named. Mesopotamia isn't dead, it's everywhere. Not in monuments, not in museums, in us. In the way we organize, the way we remember, the way we try to make order out of chaos. Every time we write something down to make sure we don't forget, that's Mesopotamia. Every time we expect laws to be public and fair, that's Mesopotamia. Every time we live in a city with strangers and assume it will work, that's Mesopotamia. We didn't invent civilization, we inherited it. It's everywhere in the systems we don't even notice. And systems, once built, begin to grow roots, deep roots. Because once you have cities, laws, writing, irrigation, you need something else. You need management. Not kings standing on balconies, not priests chanting in temples. You need people who count, people who measure, people who keep track of everything. In the shadow of the temples and palaces, a new class emerged, administrators, not warriors, not prophets, bureaucrats. It doesn't sound heroic, it doesn't sound glorious, but it might be one of Mesopotamia's most powerful inventions. Because surplus grain doesn't manage itself, taxes don't collect themselves, temples don't run on faith alone, they run on records. In cities like Uruk and later Babylon, farmers brought a portion of their harvest to the temple or palace: grain, dates, wool, oil, not as gifts, as obligation, the earliest form of taxation. At first, it was simple, a share of what you grew. But simple systems become complex when populations grow. How much does each farmer owe? How do you calculate drought years? What happens if someone lies? Clay tablets filled with numbers began to stack up inside storerooms, rows of them, thousands. Receipts stamped with cylinder seals, signatures pressed into wet clay. Proof. The temple wasn't just sacred space anymore. It was a warehouse, a vault, a treasury. Granaries stood beside shrines, massive storage rooms filled with sacks of barley, because grain wasn't just food, it was currency. Wages were paid in barley. Workers building canals received daily rations measured carefully by scribes. If you labored on a ziggurat, you were compensated in food and beer. And someone had to calculate those portions. Someone had to make sure supplies lasted through winter. Someone had to ensure no one took more than their share. That someone was the scribe. And the scribe's power grew quietly. He didn't command armies. He didn't perform sacrifices, but he controlled information. And information is leverage. A farmer who disputed his tax couldn't argue with memory, but he could argue with a tablet. And the tablet almost always won, because what was written became reality. The more complex society became, the more indispensable record keepers were. Lists of workers, lists of livestock, lists of deaths, contracts detailing marriage agreements, loans with interest rates specified in silver, even adoption papers. The state wasn't just watching, it was documenting. And documentation creates authority. But authority has a shadow: corruption. Human nature doesn't disappear just because you invent writing. There are tablets recording complaints against officials, accusations of missing grain, of rations diverted, of administrators favoring relatives. Some cases ended in punishment, others in silence. The system was sophisticated, but it was still human, and humans bend systems. Yet even flawed bureaucracy did something remarkable. It made governance predictable. It allowed large populations to function without constant chaos. It created the psychological shift from tribe to state. When you pay taxes to a temple, instead of handing grain directly to a chieftain, you're participating in abstraction. You're trusting a structure. You're believing the system will hold, and that belief changes behavior. People plan differently when they trust storage systems. They invest in larger fields. They take calculated risks because they assume stability, and stability is power. But there was another form of power rising quietly in Mesopotamia: time. Before cities, time was simple: day and night, seasons, rain and drought. But cities need precision. You need to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold festivals, when to collect taxes, when to mobilize soldiers. So Mesopotamians looked up, not casually, systematically. They watched the sky night after night. They tracked the moon's phases. They noticed patterns in the wandering lights: Venus rising before dawn, Mars glowing red against darkness, eclipses that swallowed the sun. And instead of fearing randomness, they searched for order. They divided the year, 12 lunar months, each month tied to cycles in the sky. But lunar months don't perfectly match the solar year, so they adjusted, added extra months when needed, because agriculture demanded accuracy. Calendars weren't decoration, they were survival tools. And then there was their number system, base 60. It sounds strange today, but 60 is elegant. It divides cleanly. It handles fractions smoothly. They used it to measure angles, 360 degrees in a circle, a reflection of their year. They divided hours into minutes, minutes into seconds, And even though we use digital clocks and atomic time, the skeleton remains theirs. Every ticking second carries a trace of Sumer. But measuring time wasn't only practical, it was political. Because whoever controls the calendar controls the rhythm of society. Festivals happen when authorities declare them. Taxes are due on specified days. Debts expire according to official records. Time becomes standardized, shared. And once time is shared, society synchronizes. Imagine 40,000 people following the same calendar, planting together, celebrating together, mourning together. That's unity. Not emotional unity, structural unity, and structure builds endurance. They also mapped the heavens into meaning. Constellations became stories. The path of the sun became divine narrative. The movement of planets was read as omens. If Mars appeared bright, war was near. If an eclipse occurred, the king might be in danger. Astronomy and astrology weren't separate disciplines yet. They were intertwined. But even inside that religious framework, there was data. Tables predicting celestial events, records spanning generations. Accuracy improved over time. Observation refined belief. It was an early dialogue between myth and measurement. And measurement extended beyond the sky. It stretched across land, across water, across borders. Because once you have surplus and stability, you look outward. Mesopotamia did not exist in isolation. It connected. Caravans left cities like Ur and traveled east toward the Indus Valley, toward a civilization we now call Harappa. They traded wool and textiles for precious stones, lapis lazuli from distant mountains, carnelian beads, exotic woods. From the north, metals flowed down, copper from Anatolia, tin from eastern highlands. Together they formed bronze, stronger than stone, sharper than previous tools. Bronze transformed agriculture, transformed warfare, transformed status. Metal wasn't abundant in Mesopotamia. They had to import it, which meant diplomacy, which meant agreements, which meant long-distance trust. Ships sailed the Persian Gulf, small wooden vessels hugging coastlines, carrying grain, dates, wool, returning with timber, stone, shell. Ports buzzed with languages, accents mixing, weights and measures standardized to avoid disputes. Seals pressed into clay to verify authenticity. For the first time, economies weren't local, they were regional, interdependent. If tin shipments failed, bronze production slowed. If trade routes were blocked by conflict, cities felt the strain. Globalization didn't begin in the modern age. It began here, in dusty markets, where merchants negotiated under the sun, where contracts were witnessed and sealed, where risk was calculated. And cultural exchange followed trade. Art styles blended, religious ideas traveled, stories moved from one river valley to another. Even the flood myth may have journeyed along these routes, carried in memory, carved into clay, adapted across languages. Trade does more than move goods. It moves ideas. And ideas, once in motion, rarely stop.
Mesopotamia wasn't just inventing civilization internally, it was exporting it. Techniques, concepts, administrative models, measurement systems. Other societies observed, adapted, improved. Civilization became contagious. But at the center of it all, beneath trade and bureaucracy and celestial charts, there was still something simple. People waking at dawn, fields stretching toward the horizon, dust rising in the heat, children running between mud brick houses, a scribe pressing wedges into clay, a merchant counting silver, a priest watching the sky, a canal worker clearing silt under the burning sun. The systems were grand, but the hands that built them were ordinary. And maybe that's the most powerful thing about Mesopotamia. It wasn't built by legends, it was built by repetition, by counting grain, by tracking stars, by signing contracts, by digging channels, by showing up every day and choosing order over chaos. And that choice, repeated across centuries, is why its echo still reaches us now. And inside that order, not everyone stood in the same place. Some voices were louder, some quieter, some recorded in stone, others hidden between the lines of contracts. If you walk through Mesopotamia in your mind, past the granaries and canals, past the markets and the temple gates, you will find her. A woman standing in a courtyard, sunlight catching the dust in her hair. She is not invisible, but she is not fully free either. Women in Mesopotamia lived inside structure, sometimes protected by it, sometimes confined by it. And like everything else in this civilization, their lives were written down on clay. Marriage was not romance first, it was contract. Two families negotiating terms, a bride price paid by the groom's family, a dowry provided by the bride's, the agreement pressed into wet clay, witnesses present, seals rolled across the surface. This wasn't symbolic, it was enforceable. If a husband abandoned his wife without cause, he owed compensation. If a wife committed adultery, the penalties were severe. The rules were not equal, but they were defined. And definition creates space. Within that space, women could own property. They could inherit from fathers. They could manage dowries independently. Some loaned silver. Some ran workshops. Some kept taverns. There are tablets recording women hiring workers, women buying land, women signing their names through seals, not as extensions of men, but as legal actors. In certain cities, priestesses held extraordinary status, high-ranking women dedicated to temple service. The Entu priestess of the moon god in Ur, for example, lived in a complex attached to the temple. She controlled estates, managed laborers, oversaw rituals. She was spiritually powerful and economically significant. Religion opened doors that society sometimes closed. But freedom was not universal. Most women worked inside households, grinding grain, weaving wool, brewing beer, managing food supplies, raising children. The work was constant, essential, invisible to history unless recorded in a receipt. And social limitations were real. A woman's reputation mattered intensely. Sexual conduct was policed more strictly for her than for men. Inheritance laws often favored sons. Public office was dominated by males. Violence against women existed. Punishments for disobedience could be harsh. Mesopotamia did not invent patriarchy. It organized it, structured it, gave it rules. And sometimes, within those rules, women negotiated power. But beyond gender, there was a wider structure shaping everyone's life, a pyramid. At the top, the king, chosen by gods, or so the inscriptions claimed. Below him, nobles, high officials, priests, military leaders. Below them, merchants, artisans, skilled workers, then farmers, laborers, and at the bottom, slaves. Every civilization casts a shadow. Mesopotamia was no different. War captives filled the lowest tier. When cities were conquered, survivors were marched away, men bound, women and children separated, assigned to fields, households, construction sites. Some became permanent property, their names recorded alongside livestock. Others were absorbed gradually into households, given limited rights, but always marked by status.
Then there was debt slavery. More common, more complicated. If you borrowed silver and could not repay it, you might sell your labor, sometimes for a fixed term, 3 years, 4. After that, release. This wasn't modern chattel slavery, it was contractual servitude. But for those living it, the distinction might not have felt comforting. A father might give a son as collateral. A husband might pledge his wife's labor.
Economic failure had human consequences. And yet, social mobility was not impossible. A slave could sometimes buy freedom. A skilled worker could rise into merchant class. A merchant's son might become a scribe. Hierarchy existed, but it wasn't frozen. Still, the pyramid defined expectations. Law codes assigned different penalties based on class. If a noble injured another noble, one punishment. If he injured a slave, another. Human value was measured differently, not equally. Structured inequality became normalized, and that normalization made the system stable. Uncomfortable, but stable. Because when roles are defined, people know where they stand, even if where they stand is unfair. This is the tension at the heart of civilization. Order brings safety. Order also locks people into place. Mesopotamia built extraordinary systems, but those systems depended on labor, on hierarchy, on exploitation at times. It is easy to romanticize mud brick cities from thousands of years away. Harder to see the calloused hands beneath them. Which brings us back to architecture, to the skyline, to structures rising above dust and noise. Ziggurats. They dominated the horizon, layer upon layer of mud brick ascending toward the sky. Not smooth like pyramids, stepped, tiered, massive, built without cranes, without steel, without machines, just human effort. Why build so high? Because height means visibility, and visibility means authority. A ziggurat could be seen from miles away. Constant reminder that the gods lived above, and the city was aligned beneath them. At the top, a shrine, small, sacred, accessible only to priests. The climb itself was symbolic, from earth to heaven, from ordinary to divine. Sacred height equals sacred proximity. The higher you stand, the closer you are to the gods. Architecture was theology in brick form. But it was also politics. To build a ziggurat required coordination. Thousands of workers, clay shaped, dried, stacked, reeds woven into mats, bitumen used as mortar, supply chains moving materials constantly, food rations distributed daily to laborers, schedules maintained, supervisors overseeing teams. It was organization on a massive scale, and monumental building has psychological effect. When you live beside something enormous, something enduring, something that dwarfs you, you internalize its permanence. You accept the system that created it. Monuments say, this order will last, this power is stable, this city is eternal, even if none of that is true. Kings inscribed their names into foundations, declared divine favor, claimed to have built for the gods, but the labor belonged to the people, workers hauling bricks in blistering heat, water carriers moving between scaffolds, craftsmen shaping decorative elements. It was collective effort directed by centralized command. Architecture becomes a mirror of governance, structured, layered, hierarchical, and once the structure stands, it shapes identity. Imagine being a child in Ur, growing up beneath a towering ziggurat, watching festivals climb its steps, hearing drums echo off its walls, smelling incense drift down into the streets. That building would define your sense of place, your understanding of order, your idea of where humans stand in the universe, small, below, looking up, and yet proud, because the structure was yours too, built by your city, representing your god. Architecture is frozen ideology. Mesopotamia understood that long before the term existed. Every brick pressed into place carried meaning. Every staircase carved into elevation reinforced belief. And across centuries, as rulers changed and empires shifted, the ziggurats remained, weathered, repaired, rebuilt, standing above shifting politics, a reminder that power is not just exercised, it is displayed, measured in height, in scale, in shadow cast across the ground at sunset. And beneath those shadows, life continued. Women negotiating contracts, slaves clearing canals, scribes tallying grain, merchants arguing prices,
children learning to climb stairs 2 at a time. Civilization is not one invention. It is accumulation, layer upon layer, like a ziggurat rising from flat earth. And with every layer, complexity deepens, inequality sharpens, belief strengthens, control expands. But so does human imagination, because even inside hierarchy, even beneath towering monuments, people continue to adapt, to negotiate, to survive, to build. And that quiet persistence, more than kings, more than laws, more than temples, is what keeps civilization standing. And yet, for all its structure, for all its temples and contracts and carefully measured grain, Mesopotamia was never quiet for long. Because when cities grow rich, they grow visible. And when they grow visible, they become targets. Warfare in early Mesopotamia did not begin as grand campaigns. It began with arguments over water, a canal redirected slightly, a boundary stone moved, a field irrigated by the wrong village. In a land where survival depended on rivers, control of water was control of life. So disputes escalated. At first, raids, small bands of men with spears and shields, quick strikes at harvest time, burn a field, steal livestock, retreat before retaliation. But as cities fortified themselves, war changed. Walls rose around urban centers, not symbolic walls, thick defensive barriers of mud brick, high enough to discourage ladders, strong enough to resist rams. And once walls exist, warfare evolves. Because you no longer fight only soldiers, you fight stone and clay. Siege warfare was brutal patience. An army would surround a city, cut off trade, block water routes, wait. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Inside the walls, food dwindled, grain rationed carefully, animals slaughtered early, families growing thin, disease spreading through cramped streets. Outside, attackers built ramps, constructed battering rams with wooden frames, covered them in wet hides to resist fire. Archers positioned on elevated platforms. The goal was not just to breach walls, it was to break will. Psychological warfare became as important as weapons. Messages delivered to city gates, promises of mercy if they surrendered, threats if they did not. And sometimes those threats were illustrated. When the Assyrians rose to dominance, they perfected terror as policy. Under kings like Ashurnasirpal II and later Sennacherib, warfare was not hidden, it was advertised. Reliefs carved into palace walls depicted conquered cities in graphic detail, prisoners impaled, leaders flayed, bodies stacked outside gates. It is difficult to read those accounts without discomfort, but discomfort was the point. Assyria wanted its enemies afraid before battle began. Fear saves resources. If cities surrender at the rumor of your arrival, you don't waste soldiers breaching walls. So reputation became weapon. Word traveled across trade routes. Assyria is coming. And often, gates opened before the first arrow flew. But brutality alone does not build empire. Innovation does. The Assyrians refined military organization, professional standing armies, units specialized by function, archers, spearmen, charioteers, later cavalry. Iron weapons replaced bronze in many cases, stronger, more durable. Iron tips on arrows, iron swords in disciplined formations. They developed early siege towers. Mobile structures rolled toward walls, allowing archers to fire from above.
Engineers calculated angles, measured distances. War became systematized, not chaos. Logistics improved, supply lines established to feed armies on long campaigns. Road networks expanded, communication between distant fronts maintained through messengers. Empire was no longer seasonal, it was continuous. But war leaves marks, fields trampled, canals damaged, populations displaced. When cities were conquered, captives were relocated deliberately. Entire communities moved from one region to another, a strategy to prevent rebellion. But displacement strains identity, strains land, strains resources. Mesopotamia thrived on organization, but it lived under constant pressure, and pressure over centuries weakens foundations. The rivers that gave life also demanded vigilance. Irrigation was triumph, it became burden. Each year, canals required clearing, silt accumulated, waterways clogged. If maintenance failed even briefly, fields dried or flooded unpredictably. But the deeper problem was invisible: salt. When river water spreads across flat land and evaporates under relentless sun, minerals remain. Year after year, that residue builds. Soil salination slowly poisoned fields. At first, wheat yields dropped, so farmers shifted to barley, more tolerant. But even barley cannot endure endlessly. Tablets record declining harvests over centuries. Fields once fertile, becoming white-crusted under sunlight. Farmers working harder for less return. Environmental damage compounded strain. Deforestation reduced wood supply. Timber needed for construction, fuel, shipbuilding. Timber cut faster than it regrew. Without roots to stabilize soil, erosion increased. Sediment filled canals more quickly. Maintenance required more labor required more organization required stable authority, a delicate balance. And then the rivers shifted. The Tigris and Euphrates do not flow obediently forever. Channels change, flood patterns alter. A city thriving on one bank might find itself stranded decades later. Trade routes disrupted, ports silting up, agricultural zones drying. Climate instability added unpredictability. Periods of drought appear in sediment records. Years when the floods were too weak, years when they were too strong. In a system built on precise control of water, variability is destabilizing. Civilization feels permanent when walls stand tall, but its foundations are fragile. Food supply, environmental balance, political stability. Remove one and cracks appear. Remove two and collapse accelerates. By the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, wider regional disruptions hit multiple civilizations. Trade networks faltered, cities burned. Invasions from groups we still debate today. Mesopotamia did not vanish overnight, but its dominance shifted. Empires rose and fell more rapidly. Assyria expanded dramatically, then collapsed suddenly in 612 BCE, when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes destroyed Nineveh. The great capital reduced to rubble, its palaces burned, its monuments shattered. For a moment, it seemed as if terror had consumed itself. Yet even in collapse, something survived, buried beneath ruins, sealed by fire, preserved by accident. In Nineveh, under the rule of Ashurnasirpal, an Assyrian king who prided himself not only on conquest, but on literacy, something unusual had shaped form: a library. Not a temple archive of transactions, not a palace record of taxes, a deliberate collection of knowledge. Ashurnasirpal claimed he could read and write, a rarity among kings. He ordered texts gathered from across the empire, scholarly works, medical treatises, astrological charts, myths, incantations, administrative documents, copied meticulously onto clay tablets, stored systematically in palace rooms, thousands of them, stacked in rows, categorized, cataloged, an attempt not just to rule the present but to preserve the past. When Nineveh burned, the palace collapsed, the clay tablets baked in the intense heat, hardening permanently. Had they been parchment, they would have vanished. Had they been wood, they would have turned to ash. But clay, once fired, endures. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered those rooms. Over 30,000 fragments recovered, pieces of a civilization's memory. Among them, the Epic of Gilgamesh, fragments that allowed modern scholars to reconstruct the oldest surviving
civilization, not only building and conquering, but remembering intentionally, systematically. It is one thing to create knowledge, another to safeguard it, to say this matters enough to preserve, even if we do not live to see who reads it. When modern historians decipher those tablets, they are not just reading data, they are hearing voices. Farmers complaining, priests calculating eclipses, students practicing signs, poets reflecting on mortality. The fragility of Mesopotamia becomes clear here. Cities burned, empires crumbled, canals dried, but knowledge, pressed into mud, survived. Not because it was invincible, but because someone valued it enough to gather it. And that may be one of Mesopotamia's most enduring legacies. Not only that it built, not only that it fought, but that it remembered, even in the shadow of warfare, even under unstable skies, even as soil turned white with salt. It tried to hold on to what it had learned. Civilization is fragile, but memory gives it a second life. And in rooms once filled with smoke and fear, clay tablets lay quietly, waiting for someone thousands of years later to read them again. But here is the strange thing about Mesopotamia. It fell, its cities were burned, its empires collapsed, its languages faded from everyday speech, and yet the idea behind it refused to die, because civilizations are not just buildings, they are systems, and systems travel. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed, and later the Neo-Babylonian Empire weakened, power shifted eastward to the Persians. Under rulers like Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire absorbed Mesopotamian lands, not by erasing them, but by inheriting them. The Persians adopted administrative models already perfected in Mesopotamia: provincial governance, tax systems, road networks for communication, record-keeping traditions, even the concept of codified law carried forward. Instead of destroying the machinery of civilization, they improved it. From Persia, movement moved west. When the Greeks encountered the vast Persian world, they were not meeting something primitive. They were interacting with a region shaped for thousands of years by Mesopotamian structure. Astronomy, mathematics, urban planning, imperial organization. Greek thinkers absorbed mathematical knowledge that had roots in Babylonian calculation. Greek astronomy was built on centuries of sky observation recorded on Mesopotamian tablets. The idea that the universe follows patterns, predictable, measurable patterns, was not born in isolation. It traveled. Then came Rome. Rome admired Greece. Rome absorbed Greek philosophy, science, and political thought. But hidden within that chain of transmission were older foundations: administrative law, urban infrastructure, bureaucratic governance, census systems, road planning systems, taxation frameworks. The idea that a state functions through written records and structured authority. By the time Rome built its vast empire, it was unknowingly carrying forward ideas first tested between the Tigris and Euphrates. And Rome did what great empires do. It spread its systems across continents. Europe inherited Roman law. Legal codes evolved, but the core principle remained. Rules should be written, authority should be documented, agreements should be recorded. Centuries later, modern legal systems still operate on that assumption. We sign contracts, we register property, we document identity, We expect government to function through administration, not personal whim. That expectation began in the world's earliest cities. Even time itself carries Mesopotamia's fingerprint. The division of an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds, a circle into 360 degrees. These traces come from the base 60 system developed in ancient Babylon. Every time we check the clock, we are using their mathematics. Every time we map coordinates, we echo their calculations. The idea that knowledge should be written and preserved, that too survived. Libraries, archives, universities. The belief that learning must be stored for future generations. Ashurbanipal's instinct to gather the world onto tablets lives on in digital servers and national libraries today. Mesopotamia's cities are ruins now. Uruk is dust. Nineveh is fragments of walls. Babylon is archaeological memory. But the structure of civilization they pioneered continues. The concept of the city as an organized hub. The idea that law stands above individuals. The belief that administration creates stability. The recognition that knowledge must be recorded. These are not ancient relics, they are daily realities. And perhaps that is the greatest proof that Mesopotamia never truly disappeared. Empires rise and fall, names change, languages evolve, but certain ideas once discovered cannot be undone. Once humans learn how to build systems, how to organize society beyond tribe and instinct, that knowledge becomes irreversible. Mesopotamia was not perfect. It had brutality, inequality, war, environmental damage, hierarchy, but it also carried a powerful realization. Order can be created, chaos can be managed, life can be structured. And when that realization entered human history, it never left. So when we look at modern skylines, government buildings, courtrooms, schools, we are not just looking at the present. We are looking at the long echo of a decision made 5,000 years ago to settle, to write, to record, to govern. The cities of clay are gone, but the idea they built still stands. And that idea will probably outlive us too. From people who became the first bureaucrats, counting grain, collecting taxes, and managing temples, from those who realized that order requires record-keeping and that controlling surplus means controlling power, from people who measured time, not just days, but hours, minutes, and seconds, and learned that tracking the heavens could give humans a measure over the world, from traders who crossed deserts, rivers, and seas, carrying copper from Anatolia, timber from Lebanon, and lapis lazuli from distant mountains. They connected cities that had never met, proving that commerce and culture could travel farther than armies. From the women who held property, ran businesses, and maintained temples, shaping society even under strict social limits. From the enslaved and indebted, from captives of war and the laboring poor, whose work built cities and monuments, yet their lives reminded everyone of civilization's shadow side. From ziggurats rising in stepped grandeur, symbols of divine proximity, where humans organized labor to reach for the heavens and demonstrate that power could be monumental. From soldiers of Sumer and Assyria, whose fearsome strategies and relentless campaigns taught that intimidation could preserve empires and that warfare itself could be a form of organization. From fields slowly poisoned by salinization, from rivers that shifted and floods that reminded them that even the greatest cities were fragile. From the library of Ashurbanipal, where scribes pressed thousands of tablets, preserving not just economic records, but stories, myths, and knowledge, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, so that human story could survive beyond empires and rulers. From Mesopotamian systems carried into Persia, adapted by the Greeks, inherited by Rome, and passed down to us, we see that civilization is a chain of ideas traveling through time, across continents, and through cultures. From canals and city walls to codified law and schools of scribes, from temples and priestesses to markets and merchants, from warfare, hierarchy, and slavery to monumental architecture and timekeeping. The first cities were not perfect. They were human, they were messy, they were unequal, they were fragile, and yet they were extraordinary because they were attempts to solve problems, to manage chaos, to survive, and in doing so, to invent the foundations of civilization itself. And the lesson is simple. Civilization doesn't require perfection. It requires persistence. It requires people willing to organize, to record, to innovate, to connect. From mud bricks to ziggurats, from scribes to libraries, from canals to empires, from Mesopotamia to Persia, Greece, Rome, and us, the world we inhabit today is built on their efforts. The rivers still flow, the dust still rises. Beneath it, clay tablets, fragments of walls, and remnants of temples lie silent, waiting for us to remember, waiting for us to see that everything we call modern was once impossible until someone tried. So when you walk through a city, check the time, read a law, or follow a map,